Hello, and welcome to this Forum for Philosophy event, co-sponsored by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. We are on the road. We have a hashtag #LSE Forum, and a handle @Forum Philosophy, so do tweet along. My name is Sarah Fine. I'm a fellow at the Forum, and I teach philosophy at King's College London. What is travel? What have philosophers said about it? Why do we do it? And what's the value of it? How and why is travel politicized? And what's the future of travel in the face of 21st century developments and crises? Joining us to discuss the politics and philosophy of travel, we have a fabulous panel, and I'll introduce them now. Colin Clark is Professor in the School of Education and Social Sciences at the University of the West of Scotland. He works in Romani studies and ethnic and racial studies, with a special interest in migration, identity and citizenship. He sits on the board of directors of the Glasgow-based anti-racist organisation, the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights. He's a trustee of the Roma rights group, 𝘊𝘰𝘰𝘬𝘊, and among other writings, he's co-author of Here to Stay, The Gypsies and Travellers of Britain. Nick Hayes is an author and illustrator. His graphic novels include The Rime of the Modern Mariner, Woody Guthrie and the Dust Bowl Ballads, and Cormorants. As an illustrator, he has produced numerous book covers, including For Lark by Anthony McGowan. He's also a printmaker and political cartoonist for The Guardian and The New Statesman, and he's author of the Sunday Times bestseller, The Book of Trespass. Emily Thomas is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Durham University. She's author of Absolute Time, Rifts in Early Modern British Metaphysics, and editor of Early Modern Women on Metaphysics. Her most recent book, and most pertinent for today's discussion, is The Meaning of Travel, Philosophers Abroad. Thank you all and welcome. So first of all, we're going to think a bit about travel as a source of knowledge about ourselves and the world. So Emily, would you mind getting us started with that?
Thanks, Sarah, happily.
Thank you.
Philosophers began to get interested in travel in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And this was the age of discovery. You had all these ships wandering off around the world, bringing back information about other places. And philosophers got just as caught up in this wave of interest as everybody else did. So it really started with Francis Bacon, who came up with a new philosophy of science, arguing that if we want to understand the natural world, we can't just sit in our armchairs and reason about it. We actually have to go out, see what's there, observe things, collect things. And Bacon inspired a whole new generation of scientists through this new underlying philosophy. Yeah, but it wasn't just Bacon. Other people got on the bandwagon. Right? So John Locke followed through on Bacon, arguing that travel can be a source of knowledge, not just about the natural world, but also about ourselves. So Locke began collecting effectively anthropological reports, so people who were describing what other societies and cultures were like, and Locke uses these to make various philosophical arguments. One of them, he thinks that travel shows us that human beings are not all born with the same innate ideas, because different societies have such different views on things like ethics and God, that clearly there can't be the same innate ideas born to everybody around the world. Other philosophers think that travel can be a source of knowledge about art, that it can give us new aesthetic experiences that can actually change the way that we think about art. And yet others look at the way that different societies have constructed political systems, and they use that to argue for various different views in political philosophy. So it's very much gathering information and using that to change our philosophy of things.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. And what about the question of how far we need to go in order to get that value from travel?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to go as far as we can. Philosophy is often, it's not just about trying to answer questions that we don't know the answer to yet. It's about coming up with questions that we haven't even thought of yet. And I think that's something that travel really does. The farther we get out into the universe or below the seas of this planet, we're going to encounter new things, and they're going to change, or at the very least make us question fundamental assumptions that we have about the world. And I think the more we can shake our fundamental assumptions, the better.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emily. Colin, can I invite you to come in here to think about travel as a source of knowledge?
Yeah, no, of course, Sarah, and well, thanks for the invitation, and also thanks to Emily there for kind of kicking us off with some really interesting kind of big kind of ideas. I suppose the points I wanted to make are really around well, initially anyway, travel as a kind of identity, as a form of identity, as a source of identity, and in the work that kind of I do, it's really, I suppose, around the reasons behind travel. What is the motivations behind travel? So, for example, within many gypsy and traveller families in the UK and across different parts of Europe, it's a form of, in a sense, commercial nomadism. That's how we can maybe understand it. And again, I should preface really all that I say by saying that I'm not a philosopher or even a historian. I'm a sociologist, and even then a bit of a pretend sociologist. But I think commercial nomadism as the economic basis of travel with purpose, I suppose we might say, that's really one really important dynamic that's at play. The other part of it in terms of travel as identity for traveller families is the way that travel and nomadism is connected to the life cycle and different parts of that. So the fairs that you probably have all heard of, 𝗏𝘗𝘍𝑜𝘆, Applebys, one of the more famous horse fairs, obviously they're all on hold at the moment due to the current situation we find ourselves in. And what you're kind of finding there is that the fairs, going back to the 1200s, and before, really, were sources of, that's how marriages kind of came about. That's how you can, again, you found out the gossip about who's doing what. And every part of the life cycle was kind of bound up with movement and with travel, and particularly the fairs. It was a source of kind of social and community reproduction. And then the third aspect, I think, that's really important here, 𝗊𝘰𝗵𝘋 𝗧𝗵, French sociologist, he talked about nomadism as being as much a kind of state of mind as being a state of reality and a state of being, and in the current circumstances, I think that's quite important to hold on to. It's a potential. It's the potential of travel. It's the potential of nomadism. And I think another way of thinking about this, when we might get onto this later in terms of the politics of it, is what I myself and other colleagues, for example, 𝘊𝘁𝘰𝘴𝘆, an Irish sociologist and activist, has talked about as the concept and the ideology of sedentarism. And we're kind of thinking about sedentarism here as an ideology of anti-nomadism. And I think that is really important to bear in mind when you think about successive government attempts, really going back to King James and Henry VIII and Queen Mary, to basically stop travel, to stop nomadism. And we see that every day. But I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you so much, Colin. That's fantastic. And Nick, can I bring you in here? Because gypsies and travellers feature quite heavily in elements of your book on trespass, don't they?
That's right, yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit about this, about what you think of in relation to travel and travel as a source of knowledge?
Sure. I mean, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you.
I guess the travel that I was most concerned with when writing my book was a kind of internal or within the nation travel. And I guess I got into traveling through the notion of the vagabond, or essentially people that were penalized or criminalized for their freedom of movement. And it was interesting to me that there's like a sort of, there's a moral bridge between the practical and the moral when it comes to the language that we use for people that sort of stray off the path. Even that phrase has a sense of the kind of moral deviance kind of thing. But this idea that you can be a vagabond or that you can be someone that is to be suspected of something undefined, simply by not keeping to your designated space, or simply by moving on, kind of presupposes that the lines that are put there, sort of your designated territory, kind of presupposes that those lines have an inherent, they are right in their own sort of inherent quality. The question that I wanted to ask was, who put the lines there? Who decides who's allowed to go where? And actually, what are these things based on? So one of my chapters deals very specifically with this sense of why are we so scared of the person or the family or the communities that are in perpetual motion? What is it about moving that people find so terrifying? And actually, it really, and it exists to this day. And actually, this conversation we're having, we're about to see the criminalization of trespass, which is an act that the Conservatives have been baying for the last 10 years. And finally, 𝘊𝗶𝗵 is going to, gloriously bring it in, probably about March. And it's interesting because in some ways, it's an act that incorporates every single person that enjoys the freedom of the countryside. In other ways, it's one of those things that is just basically camouflage for bigotry against people that travel. So yeah, I guess for me, what I was interested in is the notion that to travel is to wander freely. And it's a kind of semantic accident that wandering and wondering are so similar. But again, it's one of those bridges where the practical exercising of your right to freedom of motion does also kind of create the ability to wonder and to just see different things that spark the imagination. So my book was essentially an investigation into why exploration and wonder have been so heavily criminalized over the past 1,000 years.
Thank you, Nick. That's fantastic. And that actually brings us beautifully into the next section of our discussion, because I wanted Colin to get us thinking about how and why travel is politicized, racialized, and criminalized.
This is, yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing project and it's a very big question. I mean, to my mind, you know those, the children's series, The Horrible Histories? You know those ones?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to my mind, I think maybe Nick's next project, or maybe actually Ď 𝗏𝗏, who's an English Romany gypsy, wrote a brilliant book a couple of years ago called The Stopping Places, and he kind of gets into some of the issues that Nick gets into as well, with this idea of, why is movement penalised? Why is it criminalised in the way it has? And I suppose one route into this issue about politics, race, and the racialization aspect, which I think is really important as well to think about, and the criminalization aspect, I keep going back to not just this idea of a horrible history, writing a kind of a horrible history version of it, but also remembering an event I went to outside. It was a protest actually outside the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and it was about the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994. And that, you can go back a lot further. As I said, you can go back to the 1200s, 1500s, King James and all the rest of it. But to bring it up to the modern time, when you think about what that act tried to do and did do effectively, it ripped up the need for local authorities to have site provision. for gypsies and travellers in their areas. It also, of course, tried to do away with rave music, a succession of repetitive beats. I'm sure, I don't know if you're old enough to remember that, but you know, the government went full force out. And in many ways, what Patel is trying to do now, which Nick was talking about earlier there, is kind of going back to that. It's this idea of how do we clean up the countryside? This notion of the rural idyll, which is really important to my mind, I think, in the English mindset. Scotland as well, I think. Obviously, I've got a bias there, but I think in the Scottish mindset as much as the English mindset as well. But I suppose one other aspect, and you can look at the work of David Mile, you can look at the work of Becky Taylor, who are historians that have researched this. And a lot of it does come down to this idea of what we can think about, and maybe it is too strong a term, but I don't think it's inappropriate, is the idea of a kind of social, an ethnic, a kind of cultural kind of cleansing and genocide. Except what we're seeing now, and have seen really since many, many generations now, it's been enacted through law and policy rather than through guns and bombs. Although at one point, you know, you could be deported and you could be hung if you were deemed to be a gypsy, or you know, in the United Kingdom. So I think that's a kind of important point. The other thing I think that's also important to be inclusive here is when you think about travels across borders. This immediately, of course, brings us to the issue of Brexit, and particularly the situation of Romani communities from Central Eastern Europe who are in the UK right now. Very precarious status in terms of their position and their belonging within the United Kingdom. And getting settled status as anyone that's applied for it is not an easy thing to do, particularly if you don't have the right documentation with you. And then the other part of it, I suppose, is the impact of COVID-19. And I've seen this particularly up here in Glasgow, the impact it's had on show people, on fairground travellers and fairground families. It's had a devastating economic impact on those families, and the Showmen's Guild, you know, have been very eloquent in trying to canvass the government for support on that. So what you've seen, I think, over the duration is a kind of merging together of the politics, the racialization and the criminalization of, and a distrust, and that's what Nick was kind of coming on to, I think, this idea of a distrust in someone that's just a bit too nomadic, you know. And we can talk about the language that's used there. I mean, you know, families will not talk about unauthorized encampments. You know, they talk about roadside sites that they've used for generations, and they come back one summer and they find that it's been fenced off and they can't use it anymore. And I think that semantics and language is really important to appreciate there too. But I'll stop there.
That's really fascinating. Thank you. Nick, can I go over to you now to follow up on this issue of the politicization of travel?
Yeah, of course. I mean, just listening to Colin just there's also like another element that hasn't been spoken of that actually is the one that sticks most in the craw, which is the simultaneous vilification of traveling communities, whilst also romanticizing them as part of, you know, from the sort of historical 𝘓𝘂𝗵𝗍 folk songs, but right through to, I mean, I've just joined what might be called the sort of luxury middle class fringe of the traveling community, because me and my girlfriend just 6 months ago got a boat, and we're sort of talking at the moment amongst the community there. Something that I learned. I don't know if anyone, I assume in the crowd that I'm in at the moment, many people have read Songlines by Bruce Chatwin, where he talks about this kind of sort of Aboriginal concept of property or belonging, which is to do with the paths that are walked and the songs that are effectively maps to those paths. And something now living on the Kennet and Avon Canal, you realize that the community is alive and the community cares for each other, but the community is in a line, and your neighbors will change, but they will also remain the same, because you'll see them. If you saw them in Newbury, you'll see them in Bath at some point, kind of thing. But there's this sense that what is our solidarity with the traveling community? Because the Telegraph, you know, this happens all the time. The Telegraph will run an op-ed about how disgusting the traveling sites have been left, or how disgraceful it is and how untrustworthy traveling communities are. And at the very same time, they'll publish in their lifestyle magazine, journalists will go for a week's holiday on a narrowboat, and how delightful that all is. Similarly, Wilderness Festival that I trespass in the book of Trespass, if you really want to pay full whack, you can spend £2,000 to spend the 4 days of the festival. In the evenings, you can sleep in a gypsy caravan. Now, the notion that traveling communities, the reason I picked that particular site was because in the 1800s, it was a very popular anarchist festival where people would just turn up and, a bit like Burning Man, just bring what they had and share it with people. Up to 30, 50,000 people would attend each time. The moment that was turned to private property was the moment these people's ability, just like Colin was saying, these people's ability to come from all over and gather for very either seasonal or based on, saints' days or, sort of localized customs, that ability for people to mix and to mingle and ultimately to marry and, sort of create families, was taken away, but for the fact that every, in Wilderness Festival, every year you're allowed to rent that right back off the landowner by paying 200 quid for a ticket. So I guess one thing that I really want to say is that we have become used to the commercialization and the kind of exoticization of our rights to the countryside. And it's become so kind of fused in the marrow of our bones. It's become the orthodoxy. And that's obviously the other side of that coin. One side of the coin is that has allowed us to accept the limitations to our freedoms, but the other side of the coin, it has to come with this sense of suspicion of anyone that has refused to accept that yoke. Was there something more specific?
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you. I want to come back to Emily now on this theme, but moving in a slightly different direction. So the ethics and the politics of travel very much come through in your book. So on the one hand, of course, we've got the kind of privileged travel of the Grand Tour, for example, and the gendered aspect of the Grand Tour and of travel in particular historical periods. Then also you've got the ethical question about where it should be permissible to travel and so on. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about those themes, Emily.
I can. So this idea that travel is a worrying thing has been around for a long time. So Plato, 2,500 years ago, he argued that the only people who should be allowed to travel are specially selected men over the age of 40. And when they return to their home countries, they must not be allowed to mix with the general population, lest they spread worrying ideas. And this theme has really continued. So with the exception of people who were traveling for work of some kind of soldiers, mercenaries, also pilgrims, the only people who could travel for centuries, it was the ultra rich. And of course, they're white and they're male in the Western part of the world, because these were the people who had the privilege. This distrust definitely lingers today. And it's notable that for all of these political issues that we have on the one hand, and also with people like migrants, there's also this huge romanticization of tourism, that the two things go hand in hand. Exactly what Nick's saying about writing feature articles about narrow boats on the one hand and then all the problems on the other. The ethics of travel, however, I think are becoming even more pressing today for two reasons. One is that tourism is just so big now that there are so many people traveling all the time, and that leads to huge pressures on local communities who are hosting tourists, but also on the environment because of climate change. One of the things I've thought about a lot is the ethical dilemma of visiting natural wonders in an era of climate change when the very act of visiting them might actually damage them further. So there's this phenomenon called doom tourism, or last chance to see tourism, and it's been around for a really long time. You know, when there was a shipwreck, people used to rush out to see the ship before it sank beneath the waves. There are accounts of people visiting medieval battlefields before the blood has been washed away. I mean, this idea of seeing something before it's gone, that's been around for a long time. What's new now is places that are disappearing because of climate change, rising sea levels, and melting glaciers. And then the very act of visiting these places is going to produce CO2, or even more directly, maybe if you're swimming out to coral reefs, you're going to be accidentally kicking the reefs. So that's actually going to hasten the demise of these places. And then it starts to seem really unethical to be doing this last chance tourism. And honestly, I really think the solution has to be that we have to find ways to visit them responsibly. And if that's not possible, we have to stop visiting them. Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. That's really, really fascinating. Just a shout out to our audience here that you can type your questions into the Q&A section, and we'll turn to you in just a moment. So do feel free to ask questions of our panelists in just a moment. Okay, well, on this theme of the future of travel, I'd like to come back to Nick. So obviously it can't have escaped anyone's notice that we're a little stationary right now. We're not really on the road, except metaphorically. So what are we learning from our experiences of travel restrictions? And of course, of the rise of this kind of digital communication? And what's the future of travel, given what Emily was talking about, given the climate crisis, but also given things like the privatization of public space and the transformation of migration and movement controls via, for example, digital technologies. So Nick, I wonder if you could kick us off with this.
Well, from our perspective, we're running a campaign at the moment at 𝘊𝘳𝘰𝘰𝘬, where we're looking to extend the Countryside and Rights of Way Act to rivers, woodland and greenbelt, simply because the science has proven that for our mental and our physical health, we need a regular immersion in nature. Really, the one thing stopping us is just the right to be able to do that. In Oxfordshire, is a great example. You're allowed access to 10% of the woodlands. The rest are largely owned and fenced off so that people can shoot factory-reared pheasants, during the autumn months. The thing is, obviously, now people are feeling more viscerally than ever before what they've lost when they've lost their freedom of movement, but also they're now looking to nature and starting to explore some of their local rights of way, and just more than they ever have before. So in that context, and I really this is a negative thing to say, and I don't mean it as such. I'm hopefully seeing the positive in it, but there is a crippling recession coming following the pandemic. So I think more than ever, people are not going to be just like the last 10 years of austerity. There was austerity, and then the only really people that benefited were the camping supply stops, because people stopped going on holiday to Spain, to Germany, to Austria. They started to look to their own country for the entertainment. So you might go to Cornwall or Dorset as a holiday destination. We're about to really need our countryside. We're going to have our travel for Lord knows how many more years seriously affected. And there's this during the pandemic, there was this this big sort of hoo-ha about Bournemouth Beach. Everyone went to Bournemouth Beach and they left it in an absolute tip. And obviously, if we're talking about right to roam, we have to talk about litter and about how people treat the countryside. But in the 70s, in England, there was this notion invented of the honeypot, this idea that rather than let people creep and crawl and roam and ramble around your woodland or your fields, what you would do is funnel them to places with picnic benches, ice cream vans, basically create the experience of nature for people. Bournemouth Beach was a very good example of this. God knows how many rivers, woodlands, meadows people had to drive by to get to Bournemouth Beach. All of these places, these sort of forbidden lands that we have to pass before we can actually get to somewhere where we're allowed to be. So I would suggest that the future of travel, at least for the next few years, is going to be within England. And that is going to precipitate a desperate need to have more rights of access to the beautiful English countryside that everyone talks about, or, you know, like it's on a postcard, but how often do we actually get to experience it? We're going to experience it a lot more, but for that to happen, we need the rights to do it.
Thank you, Nick. That's great. And if I may turn to Emily on this theme now. Emily, you were talking about the difficulty of traveling to places that are affected themselves by us traveling there and by the effects of climate change. So I wonder if we're learning anything from our current situation about how to experience those places without actually going there. One of the themes in your book as well is about how we can learn from travel, not just by traveling ourselves, but through travel writers, through reading travel writers. So is there a way in which we can kind of capture the value of travel without doing it ourselves?
Okay, two different issues there. So the first, on this idea of traveling locally and experiencing nature, I think yes, let's do more of that. So Hendrik Thoreau wrote this book called Walden, where he ventured into the woods just a couple of miles from his town. He builds himself a log cabin and he spends 18 months wandering around the trees, looking at various things. And then he mounts this argument that we should all be living closer to nature, thinking of ourselves as a part of nature as opposed to commanding it, sort of having dominion over it. Yes, I think this would be really good for all of us to do more of. When it comes to experiencing places that are far away through travel writing rather than visiting ourselves, philosophers have had really mixed views on this. So some famously argue that actually you have a much better experience if you read a piece of travel writing about a place rather than visiting. Socrates famously said that I'm never going to leave Athens. I can learn everything I want to about the world just by rifling the pages of a book. Others, and I think I'm one of them, that argue that you lose something if you don't visit a place, that there is something that you gain from standing in a city and kind of breathing in the air. And I think what you're losing there is this sense of unfamiliarity with your surroundings. I think it's very difficult through writing to fully immerse yourself in a place that's different to where you are. You can get a sense of it, but I think it's a hell of a lot easier just to go somewhere. So yes, I think that travel writing is a really important source of information about the world, but I don't think it's ever going to replace travel.
Thank you, Emily. You're reminding me of the scene in Good Will Hunting where Robin Williams says, you know, you might have read all about Michelangelo, but have you smelled what it's like inside the Sistine Chapel? Great, thank you. And so, Colin, you already touched a bit on the way in which COVID restrictions are affecting the Roma community. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this. If, for example, you wrote recently in a blog post about the way in which members of the Roma community are being blamed for example, spreading COVID through certain kinds of behavior. So that there's another side to the restrictions here and the way in which people are affected.
Yeah, no, very much, and even before kind of COVID-19, I'm thinking here particularly of, the turn, unfortunately, that we've seen in Hungary under 𝘉𝘪𝘰𝗍𝗶 and his kind of ruling party, but also in Greece as well. And you had the allegations that before COVID, that Roma migrants, coming into these countries, including the UK, were not just we're not just terrorists, potential terrorists, which was one of the allegations that was being made, particularly with Orban, but also, disease spreaders, this idea of contagion, this idea of transmission. And in a way, it goes back to be slightly philosophical. I'm thinking here of 𝗔𝘃𝗧, who was a sociologist, but for a sociologist was quite philosophical. He wrote a brilliant essay called The Stranger, which talks about that kind of issue of the stranger who kind of comes today and actually stays tomorrow. So doesn't move on, but actually stays. And although his example in the community he was writing about was the Jewish community at that point, it could equally be applied, I think, today to many different groups who are mobile, migrant groups who are mobile across borders. And unfortunately, yes, the Roma within Europe, we're talking about a population of 8 to 12 million people, multitude of different dialects and languages within Romance. But the one thing they have in common is racism, and the racism that those communities, thinking about France, I've already mentioned Greece and Hungary. And in Glasgow, I mean, the situation with us here in Glasgow, which is where I am, what we've seen is families responding to kind of COVID-19 in a mix of different ways. Some families, somewhat worryingly, have gone home. They've decided to go back to Romania and to Bulgaria and Slovakia because they feel safer there than they do within Scotland, within the United Kingdom, because of the situation we're in here. And they've hired minibuses and vans to get back. But equally because of Brexit, and this is where you see Brexit and COVID kind of this unholy dovetailing really that's kind of going on right now. We've also seen many families trying to come in to the UK before the drawbridge of Brexit is finally bolted kind of up. So there has been some movement backwards and forwards and across borders. And I don't think that's going to change. I think that will continue because I go back to my earlier comments around the economic purpose, the material basis of travel for many different communities, of whom Roma families are one example of that. But yes, I mean, I think it's just really concerning the language and the terminology and the vilification that the communities have faced from politicians and journalists who kind of should know better. But again, the unfortunate situation in Glasgow is the vast majority of Roma families from Central Eastern Europe live in the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon's constituency. So for that reason alone, journalists and certain politicians who are not within the SNP use it as a bit of a human rights kind of big stick to beat the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon with. And I think the constituency of Govanhill is quite unique in that sort of sense. You don't see that, for example, in Manchester and Sheffield and London and some of the English cities which have large Roma minorities within them. So yes, it's not a good news story, I'm afraid to say right now.
Thank you very much, everyone. Well, I'd love to bring in our audience now, who've been thinking about the issues that you've raised. And the first thing I want to mention is a compliment. We've got a compliment from Luc Delanoë to Nick, who loves your drawings and loves the Book of Trespass. But the reason I wanted to bring this up, Nick, is because you mention in the book itself that having the drawing, doing that as you're sitting, being able to draw sort of gives you a purpose and means that people look at you in a slightly different way, not necessarily as somebody who's just sort of loitering in the wrong place, but you've sort of got a job to do. So I wondered how much the kind of the illustrations and the experience of moving around came together for you.
Oh, well, I mean, I only really started trespassing because I don't know, when I was a kid and sketching about my local village, there's only so many times you can draw the one right of way through the wood before your natural curiosity takes over and you see that fallen oak tree over there, and it's a lot more interesting than the farmer's barbed wire. And so that's what led me over the fence in the first place, I think. But then, if I'm honest, I think I put the pictures in because over 10 years of being an illustrator, I have realized how people do have a kind of weakness for a pretty picture. And I knew that the risk that I was taking to do this book, that if I didn't do it right, it would be like, who the hell does he think he is? What kind of ruffian or vandal or vagabond, or you know, there would just be, and there has been just a stunning amount of apoplectic rage that I should do anything so bold as sit in the shade of a tree and draw. But I realized that drawing was a really good example of a kind of creative response to nature and to beauty, an example of an enthusiasm, but also, and I'm afraid to say it has just worked on a very basic level, people see the drawings and think, oh, well, he must be all right. And there's an awful lot of that, but most of the book goes into talking about the kind of people that landowners or the landowning establishment don't have the same, you know, I'm pretty posh, I'm white, I'm male. It's pretty easy for me to, even if a gamekeeper comes up with a, you know, double barrel and starts shouting at me, it's pretty easy for me to wheedle my way out of it by just being a bit sort of _𝗔𝗵𝗔 Hugh Grant kind of ever so sorry. If I had a different color skin, if I was female, if I didn't identify as such, one of the whole things about property is that it decides what is proper and what is okay to happen on this land, completely disregarding any kind of, like, there's no need to refer to outside morality. It's your land. You have full dominion over it. And that's what Colin was talking about, the Criminal and Public Order Justice Act in 1994, was this, ostensibly it raised trespass to an aggravated level, but underneath the level, which basically meant you could get nicked for it. Underneath, what it did was get rid of what Thatcher called the permissive society. It got rid of, or tried to get rid of, hunt sabs, ravers, travelers, protesters. Exactly, and protesters almost certainly will be affected, of the nature of HS2 and all of that, will almost certainly be affected by this criminalization of trespass. By limiting people's rights to access land, you're essentially covert dog whistle deciding who are the right and wrong people to exist in the country. Anyway, so I put the drawings in because I have noticed that people seem to think that that makes it okay. It's okay whether you draw or not. That's what my book's trying to say.
Wonderful, thanks. And I want to pick up on a question here from Oliver Goodworth, who asks about virtual reality. And this ties into something Emily was saying earlier. So we have a question about whether virtual reality might be able to offer us a kind of immersive experience in a foreign place. And would a virtual reality facilitated voyage lack something, even if it were a perfect replication of a place? So Emily, what are your thoughts on this issue?
This sounds like a proper thought experiment, which I really welcome. I think that's wonderful. My knee-jerk reaction is virtual reality is going to get you perhaps more than reading in some ways, but I still don't think it's going to get you all the way. And here's one example of why not. So one aesthetic experience philosophers think you can get through traveling is the experience of something sublime, a kind of pleasurable terror. And it's something like standing on the edge of a cliff, looking out over the edge. You know, you're there, it's scary, but you're not actually falling over. And I think that experience is not something you're going to get from reading a book or from virtual reality, because you're just not close enough to the source of the fear. You know that really you're safe at home on your sofa, even if in virtual reality you're shark diving. And I think that there are going to be other experiences like that you're just not going to be able to replicate with virtual reality. That said, I mean, my God, COVID times, like one of my friends has a virtual reality headset. I've been using it a lot. It's fabulous.
Wonderful. Thanks very much. Colin, we've got an interesting question from George Rustin. So he is pointing out that we've been talking about the sort of the negative trends, but is there any kind of positive story that we can tell about the way that things are going now? Have there been any sort of positive governmental moves in the direction of less discrimination, making things easier or better for members of the Roma community, for example?
Okay, I'll try and be optimistic, which is very unusual for me. In Scotland, we tend to do doom and gloom quite well, but I'll try and counter that. I mean, I would say, I suppose one sign of optimism, although things have become embroiled a little bit more recently, but I think one of the reassuring things, if you think back to 2015, 2016, when we saw so many people losing their lives in the Mediterranean, trying to exit and trying to make their escape from Syria, and the kind of the aftermath of trying to escape, you know, the hostilities and the war and the conflict that was going there. And for a brief period in time, a very brief period in time, there was some awareness and a need for assistance, and a need to and recognizing, I suppose, the securitization aspects of migration. And when states put up walls, people will usually still find a way, but you're going to kill people in the process. And out of that, I think what we saw, particularly in Germany, and also I think in Scotland, I have to say, and there was a distinction, I think, between the approach from Holyrood to Westminster, was we had two politicians, two political leaders, Angela Merkel and Nicola Sturgeon, both making very public pronouncements about the need for safety, places of refuge, the inclusion of refugees within society. And in comparison to other European states, including Westminster, I think, the rhetoric was very different. The public rhetoric was very, very different. And I wouldn't for 1 minute pretend that or be deluded to think that, for example, Scotland or Germany is any less racist than England or France. But I think those political public statements from leaders, the responsibility of political leadership is quite important. So I think that's something that, you know, I would flag up as being potentially quite interesting and quite important. And we should see more of it, really. There should be a you know, if you're given a public platform, you have a responsibility to use it wisely. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of politicians do not do that. And we've seen the consequences of that in the rise of kind of the far right, of fascism, of populism, thinking about what we saw in the States, you know, quite recently, and so on. But the other thing, the other thing I'd like to see and I'd like to hope is, I'm still a firm advocate, and this, I think, the issues will become even more pressing maybe in a post-COVID reality, is the end of nation states, you know, the end of border controls. I remain resolutely and ideologically committed to the notion of freedom of movement in every single sense, not just internally within our country, but also externally as well. And yes, that has issues to go alongside it in a practical sense. But I think fundamentally and ideologically, we need to remain committed to this idea, because we live on one planet, you know, and that's my ultimate position on this. So I trying to remain optimistic about these things.
Thank you so much, Colin. I wanted to bring back Nick again here. So we've got a really interesting question from Susan Wolf, because Nick, obviously, when you're doing your roaming, you're respectful of the places in which you find yourself. But Susan's wondering about how we can teach people to respect the natural world. So she says she's from one of the last wilderness places in the States and sees people trampling through it. So is this a concern that we ought to have? Is this something that we need to take seriously?
Absolutely. We've realized we're only like 3 months into this campaign, probably about half a year planning it as well. And we've realized that not just for the optics of it, that we need to persuade landowners that they're not going to see an increase in Lucozade bottles and Red Bull cans. They're not going to see an increase, as we saw over lockdown, of disposable barbecue burn patches and pulled up fence posts, and then going into all the sheep worrying from dogs or the crushing of ground nesting birds. We've realized that actually we need to solve this. If we're taking one step forward over the line and saying we need greater access to the countryside, the next step has to be, and this is how we're going to educate people. But it's a very current conservative government Dominic Raab-y sort of thing to blame the inherent kind of lack of virtue of the individual and to completely brush over the systemic infrastructure that has led people that way. We FOI'd the government about the Countryside Code. How much have you spent on promoting the Countryside Code? In the last 14 years, the answer was £2,000, and that was just to reprint the pamphlet. I don't know how many of you have seen the pamphlet. It's there's just like 6 bullet points on a bit of illustration that someone did on a computer 5 minutes. Like the Countryside Code used to be in the 70s taught in schools. Children used to practice the Countryside Code by going out into the countryside and learning it viscerally. Montessori, forest schools, education in nature is a upper middle class privilege. Like for 200 years, say, since the end of the last manic spate of enclosure, and it's still going on, and actually lockdown has encouraged landowners or given them a sense of kind of justification to shut more rights of way, etc. But since then, we have become so divorced from the countryside, so divorced from understanding how to treat it, that we've essentially forgotten what we've lost, but we've also forgotten like what we can do to save it as well. So there's hugely, I understand we're running short, like we've got no time, but we are, in the next year, you'll see what we're going to do about it. But just one final point, because I don't actually buy the whole narrative that the public can't be trusted in the countryside. It is the other side of the coin that was minted by the aristocracy that says, we own the land, therefore we're the only people that can decide what to do with it. I could, for every picture you show me of litter during lockdown, I can show you 10 volunteer groups who not only volunteer every weekend just to go around and pick up other people's litter, but campaign for the health of rivers, test water samples. There's the recent victory in 𝗖𝘋𝗾, where they just completely unpaid, all gathered together and campaign to have the River Wharfe, it's the first one in England, the water quality, they campaign to have it raised to the standard of an EU bathing spot. For humans to be able to swim in it, you've got to get the water good enough for herons, for pike, for barbel, for otters, for beavers, and then humans can swim in it. Humans, I would say, are, look at Surfers Against Sewage or Trash Free Trails or Greenpeace. All of these things have been set up by humans that care deeply for nature. And this narrative that the lion's share of us will go into the countryside just so we can run amok, so I can tear a branch off an oak tree and feel good about myself. You've got to take a minute to look at where that comes from, because we all associate as people that love nature, but the majority of us probably have a sense of this sort of abstract other that has no care at all, these vandals. I would suggest that a large part of that is due to a narrative that's being forced down our throat as justification for the exclusive enclosure of English countryside.
Thank you, Nick, for that really rich and nuanced response. I'm loving this conversation. No, it's brilliant. Two questions that we've got now around the sort of gendered nature of travel again. And I'm going to bring back Emily on this issue because it's something that you write about in the book. So I wanted to ask, first of all, for you to say a little something about the gendered nature of travel now. So, for example, we know that, you know, lone traveling for women can be extremely difficult. The other issue I wondered if you could talk a bit about is this gendered conception of the philosopher who can go out into nature on their own and live in solitude with their thoughts on their own. You know, when I hear this, I'm like, oh, I wish. Especially right now, the idea of being on my own and sort of, you know, separating myself from all family responsibilities and so on. It seems like, you know, a beautiful dream, but not a possibility. So could you say a little bit about that gendered aspect for us?
I can. So in our society, various concepts, it can acquire a gender. So pinkness is often gendered female, for example, and travel is also gendered female. I think there's a really good case to be made for that. The history of travel is largely male. If you Google famous travelers or famous explorers, 19 out of 20 names are going to be male. You know, Marco Polo, Scott of the Antarctic, Captain Cook, all these kinds of people. And that history, it really sort of adds connotations to the way that we think about travel. For centuries, women weren't allowed to travel, let alone by themselves in the West. And when we first begin to get women travel writers, mostly in the 19th century, who are traveling by themselves, like it's really shocking to the general public. And actually these women were perceived to be very masculine as a result of their travels. So people say things like, oh, well, Mary Kingsley, it's a surprise on meeting her to find that she's so dainty, because they assume she's going to be this kind of big, burly, masculine woman. So there's this male history of travel that is definitely still ongoing today. It is seen to be more surprising to be a solo woman traveller than to be a solo male traveller. We still find travel writing dominated by men less and less as the year goes on, but it is still very much the case. If you look at things like prestigious prizes, editing of travel writing journals and things, it's often that men kind of at the top. Right? So that gendering is very much still around. And the solitary travel thing is really interesting because it's a less obvious way of gendering travel. So in the same way that travel is something that's historically seen as a male activity, so also is solitude. Being by yourself is something that men do. And in fact, if you look at philosophical writing on solitude, what you find is men talking about how they need to get away from their wives. The solitude is about shutting out the women. It's not something that a woman would do to go and shut out the men. And then these things come together in this genre of solitary travel, that it becomes a really male activity and a really extra unusual thing for a woman to do as a result. And that's not just like women explorers who are traveling across the seas. That also applies to things like Thoreau's wilderness travel, rambling in the woods around your home. It's seen as something a man is more likely to do than a woman.
Yeah, there was a nice line in your 5 books interview where you talked about this sort of the myth of the solitary traveller, in the sense that a lot of these travel writers are actually travelling with their wives, but the wives are sort of written out of the picture. Yeah,
It's a really common trope.
very, very interesting. Okay, fantastic. I wondered if we could say a little bit, and I'll put this to all of you. So we've got a question, an anonymous question here about the issue of whether traveling, luxury traveling to say Southeast Asian countries, to luxury resorts that don't reflect the lives of the local community, whether that's a sort of problematic form of travel. Does anybody want to come in on that issue?
I don't think it's problematic in itself, as long as it's done in a way that actually benefits the local society and isn't taking advantage. I don't see why it would be intrinsically unethical. And that said, you might wonder what the point of it is. If one of the reasons that we travel is to immerse ourselves in another society or learn about the world, it seems as though flying thousands of miles to a resort where you're surrounded by people who speak your language, who are maybe even serving you familiar food, and just isn't going to get you what you want.
Yeah, I mean, this is slightly on a tangent to that, but I remember being in Newcastle, where there's quite a large. I used to live and work down there a wee while ago, and there's a large showground families down there, the town moor. And I remember speaking to a couple of the families there, and what they do is that for two to 3 months of the year, they would ship all their, their big rides, their kind of fair equipment and the rides out to Southeast Asia at great expense. But they would make so much money in that 2 to 3 months whilst out there that it was cost effective for them to ship it out and then ship it back, and then to basically spend the rest of the year doing maintenance work on the rides in order to go back. And it was the younger families that did this in the main. And that I thought was a really interesting example of that kind of a form of commercial nomadism, which is also a form of tourism as well as industry, because obviously in the downtime that the families had when the rides weren't working, although they did work quite intensively, they were also seeing different parts of the world that they would never normally see if they were doing the fair circuit around the United Kingdom, And I thought that was I'd never heard of that before. That was probably the mid-90s, late 90s I came across that, and I thought that was really interesting. But that's kind of all I have to say on the matter, really. I've never been, that's one part of the world I know nothing about. And I think as long as it's done ethically, I think as Emily said, as long as this is done in an ethical manner and you kind of pay back to some extent, although the notion of that kind of travel right now is alien, isn't it? I mean, when will we be able to do that again, even if possible,
Yeah, thanks. Nick, did you want to come in on this issue?
I think it's about as ethical as any class dynamic can be. Like, I just don't think there is a way of going to a hotel, a luxury spa hotel, and not engaging in class hegemony, to be honest. Also, it's sort of, it might be apocryphal, but it made me think of, isn't there a French colony that has black volcanic sands? So France ships white sand from the beaches of the south of France out. We learned about this in geography. Longshore drift will take the white sand and reveal the volcanic sand. So to maintain the tourist industry on those beaches in its colony, France monthly, however long, creates the look of a white sand beach. And there's something about these, by shipping it out over, in containers, there's something about going to these places that is about control. It's not leaving yourself open to the chaos and the melee of another country and another language, and the reality of whatever it is might happen. It's it's kind of a mini gap year, isn't it? It's kind of just cushioning yourself within. It's the rich equivalent of bringing a tin of, you know, a pot of Marmite and a tin of Heinz baked beans when you, in the 70s, when you go on holiday to Spain. It's refusing to taste another culture and needing to control it. I mean, it's not even colonialism or something. It's just this sense that you need, that the way you approach life is that you need to control every aspect of it, and it slightly panics you to open yourself up to the reality of something that you don't understand. I've done it once in India. I spent like 3 months in India, and then a mate came over to visit, and she was adamant that we spend that week in a hotel. And yeah, that was just a week I didn't spend in India, basically.
Thank you. We haven't talked much, have we, about the privatization of public space? I wonder if we could say a little bit more about that from you, Nick, and from Colin. Colin, for example, we've got a question about how that the move towards privatization of public space is affecting Roma communities. And Nick, this is a theme that you bring up in your work as well. So over to you two.
Colin?
Yeah, okay, I mean, I'll just say something very briefly. I mean, one of the big, again, we go back to the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, and like I mentioned earlier, that ripped up effectively local authority site provision, and instead traveller families were asked to provide for their own sites. And the richer, and again, there's class dynamics in the traveller world as is anywhere else really, and the richer families did exactly that. They bought their own land, and they quickly learned that they had to buy the land and then apply for planning permission, because if they applied for planning permission first, it would get rejected. I mean, it's up there with the rejection rates, up there with taxi ranks and pizza takeaway hut. You just don't get planning permission. So instead, families in England in particular, it was more, you know, you'd buy the land off a sympathetic landowner, and then you'd apply for retrospective planning permission. And that's led to a situation today where many families are living on borrowed time on land that they legally own. And again, I know Nick and also 𝘠𝗵𝗵𝗍𝗶, who I mentioned earlier, they both talk about this in their sort of work. So that is a big concern, that you can't say on one hand, you need to provide your own sites and rip up local authority provision, and then say, well, we know you've tried to do it, but we're not going to let you do that because we're not going to give you planning permission to do it. That kind of leaves people and families without a home, effectively homeless, no legal place to site their trailers, their caravans, and the pitches and the site provision is not maintained. So this is a really big fear that we have. But it's no surprise. I mean, this was Thatcherism, you know, and then John Major kind of personified, really. And going back quickly to an earlier discussion, I think, Nick, one of the things we need to reclaim is, I'm sure you remember it as well, what Douglas Hurd, when he was Home Secretary, called New Age travellers. He talked about them as medieval brigands. I think we need to reclaim that one. I think medieval brigands is the way to go. But yes, I'm deep.
Medieval brigands. I think that's amazing.
Yeah. The Douglas Hurd, when he was Home Secretary, he talked about New Age travellers. This is about 92, 93 as medieval brigands. That's the imagery that he invoked, really. But the thing is, the New Age travellers that I spent time with down in the West Country in particular, they loved it. They thought this is brilliant. This is a badge of honour almost to be called the brigands. You know, they loved it. But yeah, the enclosure, the privatisation, the commodification really in neoliberal conditions is a real concern for many families, and it particularly penalises the families that need to rely on effectively social housing, social provision. That's the families I'm very worried about, because if you've got the money, if you've got the resources, if you know the lawyers, then you can fight to get retrospective planning permission. You know, families have done that; they have won cases, but you've got to have the money to do that.
Thank you, Nick.
Oh yeah, if someone called me a medieval brigand, I would be able to just laugh it off, because or a gypsy or you know, on account of living on a boat or something, because I am, my nest is feathered. Like, my parents still have a spare room that either me or my brother, if everything fell in, could go and sleep in. That's called being middle class, pretty much. What the criminalization of trespass is intending to do is, if you have, it used to be any more than 6 vehicles and you to go onto land that you didn't own, you would be criminal. Now it's 2. And we're not even sure in the boating community, like during lockdown, no mooring signs went up all along the Thames, including the place that I used to play when I was a kid, where I grew up in Beale Park. Now it's no mooring, no mooring, no mooring. If we bosh in our mooring pins with maybe, say, our boat and then a little butty, something without an engine, that counts as two vehicles. It's not just that we'll go to prison for it, it's that those vehicles will be impounded, and the vehicles are the homes. So what the Conservatives are trying to do, that, you know, they use this sort of pompous language, and we sort of knee-jerk laugh at it. We think Boris Johnson is a funny person, but it's endemic of this sort of deep-rooted mycelium of orthodoxy, that this is the right way to be someone that went to Eton, to be someone that can recite Herodotus, but not to be someone with a ring through your septum or one dreadlock. There's no basis of that. They're just scared of people that aren't like them, and they have been in power for so long. And so, like you said, everything about the privatization of public space. It used to be called enclosure. They're now called POPs, privately owned public spaces. Every space was not owned at a certain point of view. There was a time where someone put the fences up, and by putting the fences up, divested the local people of their rights to that land. Not just their rights to the resources of the land, but their right to defend the sustainability of the resources. Like, privatization is the core reason when it comes to land, of the depletion of resources, because under English law, you're allowed not just to do whatever you want with the land, but you're allowed to destroy it if you want. The Commons, public rights to public spaces, was all about, you didn't own the land, you borrowed it off your children. They were born with a deep sense that this river or this water meadow or whatever it might be was for their grandchildren. And the whole point that the commoner, that they elected reeves every year, who were basically the people to oversee that if you wanted shale or gravel or whatever, that you could take so much, but you had to be aware that you couldn't take any more than your fair share, certainly not for private profit, to sell it on down the road, kind of thing. This belonged to your grandchildren. And so the example, oh, sorry, should I shush?
We are going to have to wrap up, fascinating as it is. Thank you so much, Nick. But it's been so interesting going from Colin's comment about the ideology of sedentarism to hear all about how much a part of our lives travel, movement, mobility is, and how valuable it is in all sorts of different ways. So I want to thank our fantastic panel for that really illuminating conversation. For the audience, please do come again and join us next week, Monday, the 8th of February, for Spaced Out. Until then, bye-bye.